Hello and welcome to my talk. So this is what it's about today. We're going to speak about how BlackBerry created the perfect product, transformed the smartphone business, and then completely lost its way. So just a little bit about me. I'm a technology reporter with the Globe and Mail in Canada, and I'm also co-author of Losing the Signal, the spectacular rise and fall of BlackBerry. I hope everyone is enjoying Productized so far. So today, much of the world's economy, of course, runs through mobile phones. There are many multi-billion-dollar companies whose entire interface with customers is through handheld devices powered by Apple or Google operating systems. So it's remarkable to think how far we've come in a generation and how easy it is to forget that all of this is thanks to one Canadian company called BlackBerry. BlackBerry, which used to be called Research in Motion, paved the way for mobile data to take over our lives starting in the late 1990s. For 8 years, BlackBerry built the world's hottest mobile devices and changed how we communicate. And then it all started to fall apart. There was a lot of drama along the way. A patent fight nearly shut down the service. There was an options scandal that scarred the relationship between the two co-CEOs, Mike Lazaridis and Jim Balsillie. And there was a schism, ultimately, that hurt the company at the very worst time. So a little plug, of course, it's all in our book, which I would encourage you all to read. So today, what I'm going to do is focus on a handful of key products that define the company's rise and fall and give some historical context for each of them. So this one here is the original BlackBerry. It launched almost 22 years ago, and it did one thing really well: wireless email. As you can see from that picture there, that's actually mine. It had a monochrome screen, and it displayed all of 4 lines of text. It also lasted for 4 weeks on a single AA battery, and it could send and receive email faster than a desktop computer. And of course, it taught users how to type with their thumbs. It was the perfectly designed product for its era, when email was widely used for the first time, and where people were really being inundated with email for the first time. And there was no way to wirelessly access it on the go. Mobile data industry was in its infancy and really ran on limited networks at the time. So BlackBerry offered fun, affordable, and pleasing user experience. It let people for the first time read and answer emails where they wanted. It was the first mobile data device that people actually wanted and needed to use. And it actually, in fact, they couldn't stop using. It was an instant hit with power users like CEOs. BlackBerry's success also resulted from a series of very shrewd go-to-market tactics that leveraged the fact that the right people wanted the product and just would not give it up. Its downfall was not just due to rivals with better products. Apple and Google actually also changed the rules of the game, rules that BlackBerry had been happy to play by before that. Management was distracted and more focused on outfoxing old guard rivals like Nokia than anticipating new competitors bringing step change and innovation. Once Apple and Google arrived, BlackBerry was on the defensive, churning out products stuck in an old paradigm and out of touch with end users. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind a little bit. I'm going to give you a little bit of history. So humans discovered how to communicate wirelessly over 100 years ago, of course, Marconi. Radio came along in the 1920s, was popularized. Walkie-talkies were used in World War II. Pagers came along in the 1970s, and cell phones in the 1980s, including that big shoe-sized device that Mikhail Gorbachev is speaking into there. So this is the father of wireless data, Norm Abramson. He was an engineering professor at the University of Hawaii. He also liked to surf, which is appropriate, of course. He figured out how to send data over radio waves in the early 1970s so that campuses on the state's different islands could communicate with one another. So for years, industry players talked up wireless data as the next big thing. But by the early 1990s, mobile data was still an underdeveloped niche business. There were data networks, but they had very low bandwidth and very few customers. Communication devices were the size of televisions, and they were typically bolted into service trucks used by IBM or cable companies to reach repair crews. It was a pretty unsexy business. So at this point, BlackBerry was a small company that was developing hardware and software tools for these networks. They had equipment like wireless modems, and here a point-of-sale terminal that you can see. That's Jim Balsillie, the co-CEO on the left, and Mike Lazaridis on the right. That product they're holding was used in stadiums, particularly the one in Toronto. So during the 1990s, many tech companies, including, as you can see, Apple and Nokia, IBM, Ericsson, and so on, they all tried to bring more functions than voice to handheld gadgets and turn them into mobile communicators. There's a whole bunch there. The EO on the bottom was actually used by Bill Clinton at a demonstration in the early 90s. Problem is, all these devices were either slow, bulky, inefficient, inexpensive, or too expensive, I should say, or awkward to use. None of them were really essential. BlackBerry wanted to also create a portable data device. It was a supplier to the industry. It understood the wireless industry, data industry better than anyone. So let's take a look at their first product. This one came out in 1996. It was a two-way pager called the Interactive 900. The engineers called it the Bullfrog. The salespeople actually called it Fat Boy. As a messaging machine, it actually worked pretty well, but as a product, it had problems, as you can all see. The company had outsourced the design, and you can sort of shows, I think you can tell. The user experience was an afterthought, pretty poor, actually. The device was big, it was clumsy, it was hard to use, it was very cheaply made as well. You can see the keyboard was too busy, too many small keys. So in short, it's the kind of consumer-facing product you'd expect a startup full of engineers and specializing in components that was trying to make its first user-friendly device to do. So this is the first, you could call this the BlackBerry 0.0. Now, the idea for what became the first BlackBerry came to Mike Lazaridis in 1997. There's a closer look at it. The right device, he felt, had to be reliable and sturdy, about the size of a pager. It had to be more powerful in its capabilities, but also easy to use. It shouldn't try to do everything, but one thing extremely well: email. And it should be able to send and receive email from a user's palm as if it were a mobile extension of the desktop computer. You shouldn't have to log in and download your emails. They should just arrive on their own. Believe it or not, that was a novel idea in the late 1990s. Now, email was just starting to proliferate, and people were inundated. At the time, there were a few places to get email except on your desktop computer. And so you can imagine how bad that would be if you were, say, a traveling executive or salesperson. You'd be out on the road all day, you'd get back to your hotel at night, you'd dial up, you'd wait, you'd log in and wait for a throng of emails from that day to come into your computer. So in designing the BlackBerry, the company had a number of constraints to consider. First of all, very little network capacity. Battery life was a big one for a little handheld device. Security was important, and of course, you needed a good miniature computer. Now, Mike Lazaridis, again, he's the one on the left with the white hair. He believed that by minimizing the complexity of the user experience, BlackBerry could actually maximize its adoption. So this time he hired engineers, design engineers, and designers to properly develop the hardware in-house. So here's a picture of the Fat Boy next to the BlackBerry, so you can really see the difference. As they worked on form factor, they made a critical decision to get rid of every single key they could. So take a closer look as I walk you through. By doing that, they would balance the need to keep the device small, but not make the keys too small. By using software and programming the operating system to remove the need for physical keys, they could really do the trick. So, for example, you'll notice here, there's no period key. Instead, they made it so that you could create a period by just pressing the spacebar twice. They also got rid of shift keys. So if you wanted to capitalize a letter, all you had to do was hold the letter down and it would capitalize on its own. By using a function key, that's the orange key on the bottom left there, they could double up every letter key with numbers, punctuation, and symbols. And the thing on the right, see the track wheel, that's under where my face is on your screen right there. They adapted that from a TV remote control and turned that into the device's navigation tool. So by rolling that up and down and clicking on it to select, you could actually replace 6 navigation keys and menu keys from the Bullfrog. Now, with fewer keys and smaller size, users could cradle that in their hands and type with their thumbs. It was a nice stylistic flair you can see with the slanted keys, which actually inspired the name BlackBerry. The designers also decided to do something really interesting. Underneath the keyboard, they used a metal dome instead of plastic or rubber, which was typical in other devices. That gave users this tactile sensation of a snap and a click back when they press the button, rather than something mushy. Now, Mike believed that typing on a BlackBerry should be so instinctive that users never had to interrupt their train of thought or navigate a whole ton of menus. For example, if you clicked on the navigation key, it should give you the one menu most relevant to what you were doing, and then pre-select the thing you were most likely to use. Like, let's say you were writing an email and you clicked on the menu button. Well, a whole bunch of commands would come up, and the thing that would be highlighted would say send. It's like the machine knew what you were trying to do. So it was all part of an approach that Mike described as, quote, removing think points. He wanted the device to be so easy, simple, and satisfying to use that people would actually prefer it to writing emails at their desktop. He had his engineers cut all the excess coding that used to come in on the top of emails so that users would just see a clean subject line and text. Again, that was novel. Emails also arrived only in 1 or 2 kilobytes at a time. So if you wanted to read more, you just have to keep scrolling. That kept transmissions small enough to prevent clogging the network. At the time, base stations could only handle 16 kilobytes per second. So every little bit of network that you could preserve actually counted. So BlackBerry's go-to-market strategy was almost as ingenious as the device itself. It's one thing, of course, to develop great-looking product that works and is sturdy like this one was. But BlackBerry had a little problem. Nobody actually knew that they wanted wireless email. The carriers, like this one in the United States, didn't get it. They just wanted a better pager. They were selling something called two-way paging at the time. Customers didn't know they wanted instant email. When they showed the first BlackBerry to a focus group and it buzzed when an email came in, one of the people there said, if that happens every time, then you'd better ship it with a hammer. BlackBerry initially thought customers would use the device to deal with urgent emails. But they also found when they talked to focus groups that stressed out people. They were just being flooded with email. Instead, BlackBerry learned something important. People responded well to the idea of BlackBerry as a convenient productivity tool. Now you could use it to respond to emails in a taxi ride, or while you were waiting in line at an airport, or perhaps sitting in a boring meeting, turning all that downtime into useful time. That shaped their messaging around the product. Another key insight came from Geoffrey Moore's book, Inside the Tornado. Mike wanted to market the devices as a new category, email pagers. But Geoffrey Moore argued that innovative technologies had the best chance of succeeding if they were sold within a proven product category. So that's what BlackBerry did. The hottest product category at the time was the PDA, the Personal Digital Assistant. So the company added contact and calendar applications and positioned the BlackBerry as a rival to the popular Palm Pilot. BlackBerry then convinced carriers to lease space on their wireless data networks so it could sell the service itself. They figured they would do that until the carriers realized it was popular and then asked them if they could sell it themselves. So BlackBerry came out in early 1999, and to get the word out, BlackBerry hired young evangelists to fan out to conferences, airport lounges, Wall Street food courts, and so on, to get the device in the hands of corporate warriors who could benefit from email on the go. They were looking for people like sales executives, investment bankers, and lawyers. And they used something called the puppy dog approach. They would put the device in their hand, say, how would you like to try wireless email out? You can have it for free for 30 days. If you don't like it, you can return it. It's like if you're selling a puppy dog. Here, take this puppy dog home. If you don't like the puppy dog, we'll take it back. Of course, no one ever returns the puppy dog, and no one ever returned the BlackBerry. Once they realized the power of email, users were absolutely addicted. M&A advisors, mergers and acquisitions, people, investment bankers would be using it. The CEO would look over and say, hey, what is that? Oh, it's a BlackBerry. Soon they wanted one on their own. Then they realized the power of wireless email and they wanted all their direct reports to have it. Well, pretty soon they wanted all their direct reports to have it. So it kind of spread like a virus. Another clever tactic BlackBerry used was this real guerrilla approach to onboarding customers. It was very simple to start as a customer. You basically just had to sign up and put a little patch of software on your own computer and you were up and running. And it was also priced so that executives could basically expense it as part of their monthly allowance. So think about that. Your information technology department doesn't actually know you have a BlackBerry, and neither does your boss. So pretty soon, a lot of organizations had hundreds of people using BlackBerries, and the IT department had no choice but to install central BlackBerry servers, and that helped to get devices out to organizations by the hundreds and thousands. So as corporations adopted BlackBerry en masse, the company used its leverage to expand globally. As you can see, that was one of the headlines early on in USA Today. So I'll give you an example. When BlackBerry wanted to go to Europe, it approached Vodafone first. Vodafone wasn't interested. So they went to Vodafone's smaller rival in Britain called O2. Well, O2 was very eager to crack the enterprise market. So they said, sure, we'll take the device. Eventually, enough people signed up with O2 that Vodafone noticed. They said, how do we get the devices? And they adopted it. So the carriers initially were a little reluctant. They didn't know how to sell these devices, but they very quickly realized that they got far more revenue from data plans than they had from just selling cell phones. Another important thing to point out about BlackBerry was on September 11th, 2001, BlackBerries became essential. They were actually the only ways to communicate in downtown Manhattan and Washington that day. So that cemented BlackBerry's importance in the business and government world in the early 2000s. So these are the roots of BlackBerry's initial success. And that's the initial BlackBerry. This is the second device I want to talk about quickly. This was called the 957. It came out in 2000, a year after the original BlackBerry. As you can see, it was a stretch of the BlackBerry with a bigger screen and a couple more keys to make it look more like other PDAs. You still have that monochrome screen. Now, suddenly Palm and Microsoft realized that BlackBerry wasn't just a harmless niche device maker. It was coming after them as well. BlackBerry adapted this device to become its first phone. It kept the form factor intact, but on the inside, it was practically a brand new device. It had a new battery, new processor, radio, operating system. Adding voice was actually an afterthought. As BlackBerry began selling the carriers and moving into 2G voice networks, it had to have voice capability. So it had this awkward plug-in accessory, as you can see, because it didn't have a built-in speaker or mic yet. And even with the speaker and mic, once they installed it, people didn't like the look of it. They didn't like to use it as a phone. Some people said it looked like a piece of toast. So BlackBerry added more features, and then over the years, they made its device look more like phones. They used predictive text software to put, as you can see in the middle device and the one on the right, they would put two letters on the key so they could make the device narrower and cut the size of the keyboard down, make it look more like a phone. And then they added features like color and camera and media player. Now, as it continued to maintain and extend its lead on wireless email over other smartphones, nobody else could catch BlackBerry. The company just kept getting more and more popular and expanded around the world. It became the favorite device of princesses and presidents, as you can see. That's Obama holding a BlackBerry. And so, through the mid-90s, it looked like BlackBerry had outmaneuvered the handset giants like Nokia and Motorola, who weren't able to make email work nearly as well as BlackBerry on their little phones. So BlackBerry's approach became doctrine. After 7 years, good battery life, little use of network space, a good keyboard, and security were as important as they had been in 1999 and still central to BlackBerry's product development. Then in 1996, BlackBerry launched the Pearl. This is its first device aimed at consumers. And what's neat here is it had a little navigation trackball. The critics loved it. You can see this here. Computer World declared that this would be the navigational device for mobile devices within 2 years. Welcome to the future, he said. But just 26 days later, after that review came out, everything changed. That's, of course, Steve Jobs on the right holding the first iPhone in early 2007. It was three things. It was an iPod, a telephone, and an internet communicator. So this was not just about product. On that day, as you can see, Apple also changed its logo, and it shortened its name from Apple Computer just down to Apple. It was sending a message. Silicon Valley was here to blow up the wireless data market that BlackBerry had created. It would do it without a physical keyboard. Everything was going to go touchscreen. That was the day that BlackBerry went from being an innovator to a follower, and it was never the same again. On that day, BlackBerry needed to change everything and get it all right away. Instead, it did the opposite. For years, the company had focused on getting the next product out and fending off Me Too rivals. It had not been preparing for a game-changing innovator. When Mike Lazaridis looked inside the iPhone, he didn't understand. Apple had put a full computer inside. He actually told his staff, if this thing catches on, we're not competing with a Nokia anymore. We're competing with a Mac. He thought that would crash the network, eat through batteries, that typing on glass would be an experience nobody would like, and that the device would have poor security. That, of course, was the opposite of all things that had defined BlackBerry's success. Business customers would never accept that in a smartphone, he thought. He was absolutely convinced of this. Now, remember, RIM had beaten back and prevailed over all the technology industry's top innovators, including Palm and Microsoft, who had tried to put a computer in people's hands 6, 7, 8 years earlier. Simple email had beaten them all. Also, BlackBerry had grown up with controlling carriers, telephone giants. Steve Jobs liked to call them the 4 orifices in the United States. They were protective and restrictive. BlackBerry's relationship was with them. It wasn't with customers anymore. The carriers kept BlackBerry from developing apps or offering more than a basic browser. They liked to protect their walled gardens from the handset makers. Now, the funny thing is that Mike Lazaridis actually was right. Network issues were a problem for the first iPhone. They clogged up the network on AT&T, which the carrier that had the exclusive right for iPhone for the first 4 years in the US. The battery life was terrible. I think the first iPhones lasted maybe 4 or 5 hours. Typing was a problem. You got lots of autocorrect issues with typing on glass. And the devices were not as secure as BlackBerry. The thing is, none of that mattered. Mike Lazaridis did not appreciate how much Apple had changed the dynamic. And just because BlackBerry's leaders thought they knew better, it didn't mean the customers agreed. Steve Jobs felt that people, conditioned by a bit of the internet on the go, email, would want a lot more. When they got the whole internet in their hands, they would be hooked. Apple had basically stolen BlackBerry's playbook and updated it 8 years later. Just as BlackBerry had outmaneuvered the phone carriers by leveraging the popular appeal of its devices, Apple did so as well, in its own way. Now, carriers were already nervous about Apple and Google and their potential to enter the telecom market. When Apple decided to make a smartphone, AT&T basically gave it unprecedented carte blanche, including the ability to open an app store. BlackBerry never had that freedom. That totally undercut BlackBerry. It was not prepared. And it was no match for the rich ecosystem of consumer apps that Apple could provide. BlackBerry's app capabilities were limited. In the past, all it was able to do were a few very rudimentary games or maybe a fancy ringtone. Its software platform was primitive. It had been optimized for one task. It was essentially a glorified radio with the thinnest of operating systems on top. Its operating system had a fraction of the memory of the iPhone. Developers of popular apps like Instagram and Netflix didn't even bother making versions for BlackBerry. Plus, the company was distracted. It had just settled a costly patent dispute, and it was dealing with a stock options scandal. Sales were growing 25% quarter to quarter. And remember, this was a hardware company, so they were struggling to keep up and expand their manufacturing globally. BlackBerry had a seeming lock on enterprise users in businesses and governments, and in developing markets where people were absolutely falling in love with BBM, their mobile instant messaging service. At BlackBerry, they thought Apple would only appeal to consumers, and BlackBerry users didn't need fancy apps like YouTube. So then things started to change. In the fall of 2007, a few months after the iPhone came out, Verizon, which is a big carrier in the United States, asked BlackBerry if it could provide an Apple killer. AT&T had a 4-year exclusive on the iPhone. Verizon had passed. They'd passed on that opportunity, and they suddenly realized it was a mistake. So they offered BlackBerry what would become the biggest contract in the company's history, backed with a massive ad campaign. BlackBerry jumped at the class. Verizon wanted a touchscreen device, so they asked BlackBerry to deliver what would be the most complex and ambitious project that BlackBerry had ever done. So this was BlackBerry's response. It was called the Storm. Now, the thing about the Storm is it showed how little BlackBerry understood the paradigm shift that was underway. BlackBerry didn't realize that the smartphone battle was now firmly about software. What they did instead was they delivered BlackBerry's version of a touchscreen. So you can't really see it from that picture, but that's not a true touchscreen device. Their solution was a mechanical clickable screen. So this entire face here, the whole glass, was like a giant button. You would press down on it and the entire screen would go down. Where the letter icons were, you'd hold your hand, say, over your finger over the icon, but the entire screen would click down and create a clicking sensation. This wasn't real true touch. It felt very mechanical. It felt like yesterday's technology. Now, from BlackBerry's perspective, it was supposed to give users a reassuring feeling of pressing a button. But BlackBerry was not solving a carrier problem. It was not solving a customer problem. It was solving a carrier problem and a BlackBerry problem. BlackBerry lacked Apple's experience making consumer-oriented computer platforms, and it was in love with its buttons. It didn't change its operating system. Inside the device, it was pretty much the same as the old BlackBerry operating system. But Verizon loved the device. It shows how much BlackBerry was relying on carriers for feedback and not end users. Also, BlackBerry had very little time to make the storm. It was a different type of phone for the company, and it needed to be ready for launch for the 2008 Christmas season, so they had under a year to get it done. As a result, the product was buggy. It was very frustrating to work with, and its mechanical parts didn't function well, especially when they filled with dust. The reviews were brutal, and consumers returned the devices en masse. In fact, the whole first shipment of 1 million devices basically came back, and Verizon wanted a refund. This was BlackBerry's first product fail since the bullfrog. Meanwhile, Verizon was 1 year on and it still didn't have an Apple killer, so it turned to others. Now, unlike BlackBerry, Google had immediately understood how the iPhone had changed the game. Google really wanted to get into the smartphone business, and when Verizon knocked on its door, it was ready. And here's what they came back with. 1 year after the storm, Verizon launched its touchscreen Droid. Now, this device had the operating system, the Android system from Google, and hardware from Motorola. This is the first popular phone using the Android operating system, and it was an immediate hit. 1 year later, Android was the most popular smartphone operating system in the world. BlackBerry was in decline. It actually happened that fast. Even worse for BlackBerry, Google did something really clever and destabilizing. It provided Android for free to any handset maker that wanted it, and gave its 30% cut of app sales to carriers. So that meant all of a sudden that all the telephone companies had a powerful incentive to promote Android phones over BlackBerries. Meanwhile, BlackBerry was wasting precious time. First, the company tried to fix the bugs in the storm. Mike was absolutely convinced if they got Storm right, it would be a hit. So BlackBerry did a Storm 2. Then it started on a Storm 3 before the carrier said, Mike, just forget it. Just do a regular touchscreen phone. Now, it's something he did reluctantly. Even after he'd resigned as co-CEO a few years later, he once pointed to a mock-up of a BlackBerry with a keyboard and said, I get this, and then pointed to a touchscreen phone and said, I don't get this. See, it took Mike too long to realize that he needed a new operating system, after first thinking he just had to fix the browser. So that would take years. Pardon me for just a moment. Now, this whole experience left BlackBerry sort of mired in strategic confusion. By the time BlackBerry actually came out with a proper, well-functioning touchscreen phone in 2013, it was 6 years after iPhone had come out. The market had just moved on, and sales of BlackBerry devices eventually dwindled down to nothing. So, as you can see, the storm was an utter disaster. Now, I want to take you to the next device. This is the final product I'm going to talk about and highlight today. It's the Playbook. Now, BlackBerry was already reeling from the storm. This product was a disaster from end to end. BlackBerry, like many many companies in the device industry, had thought for years about doing a tablet. And by early 2010, it was actually gearing up to make one. Well, once again, this guy set the agenda. Steve Jobs came out in early 2010, launched the iPad, which came with iTunes, a full browser, apps, and an e-reader. Now, Mike Lazaridis, who is the technical CEO, and Jim Balsillie, who is the sales and finance leader, immediately saw the iPad as a threat. They thought it would make inroads with their business customers that they thought they had a lock on because it was a perfect size to read documents. They realized they had to get their playbook out as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, BlackBerry was reeling from its first failed product on a grand scale, as I mentioned. Leadership was paralyzed over strategic direction, and internally the company was splitting into factions. So meanwhile, companies that had used BlackBerry started to tell their employees to bring their own devices to work after the recession. And many just gave up on their corporately assigned BlackBerries in favor of Apple and Android devices. It turned out enterprise customers were consumers after all, and they didn't necessarily just automatically love their BlackBerries. Meanwhile, Mike Lazaridis was overhauling his engineering department and putting the leaders of a new software company that they just bought in charge of the tablet project. So as you can see, there's a lot going on inside BlackBerry. They're having quality problems at this time due to rapid expansion. And BlackBerry by now is in development of their new operating system for their touchscreen devices. So the engineers realized that to get the tablet out, they'd have to cut corners to do that on time. So the main compromise was going ahead with the device without native email on the playbook. Instead, the company created what they called bridging software that BlackBerry users could use to emulate their email from their smartphones on the playbook. So the thing is, that meant the playbook would be a smartphone accessory and not a standalone device. Now, again, BlackBerry is falling into the trap of solving a BlackBerry problem and not a customer problem. The iPad had email native to its device. Meanwhile, Playbook users had to take a series of steps to get email. They had to download the Bridge app, they had to pair it with a smartphone, and then they had to wait for that bridged inbox on the Playbook to fill up with email that was moving over from their smartphones. And every time you turn on the Playbook, you'd have to repeat the same steps. So as a user experience, this was an absolute reversal of BlackBerry's original guiding principle to, quote, remove think points that had made the original device easy and intuitive to use. Another big challenge was that because BlackBerry was building a new operating system, app developers would have to start all over again to build apps for its tablet. By contrast, of course, iPhone apps worked fine on the iPad. BlackBerry also chose to lead with Adobe Air as its platform for app developers, which wasn't supported by Apple. So very few developers made Playbook apps. Now, when the Playbook launched several months late in April 2011, it supported just 3,000 apps. The Apple had 65,000 at the time. It was also a confusing device to the market. Nobody could decide inside BlackBerry if it was an enterprise device or a consumer device. The company lacked anyone in a senior role asking the tough questions about it, like whether Playbook should have ever launched without native email, which was the cornerstone of BlackBerry, or if it had the right features or technology. Ultimately, the company just got the product wrong. Mike Lazaridis believed that the defining characteristics of the tablet market would be security, reliability, and multitasking. He actually said that once on stage with Kara Swisher. Apple showed it was something different. Tablets were about style, content, and ease of use. So there's plenty of other elements to the BlackBerry story. I hope you do read the book, and maybe we can get into some of them in our discussion later on. Of course, I'd welcome you to read the book. I hope you'll learn a lot from it. But I guess I'd summarize by offering a few thoughts from my talk as a non-product person and a storyteller to all of you product experts. So I think the BlackBerry story shows us that success and innovation is obviously the result of a complex mix of having the right product at the right time, marketing the right way to the right people. That's probably self-evident. Good products help you do something you were doing more. Sorry, let me say that again. Good products help you do something that you were already doing before, a little more effectively, a little more efficiently. Great products, however, can significantly transform how a task is performed to such an extent that it actually reorders the world by more broadly reshaping human behaviors and economic activity. With a successful product, you can set standards and ground rules and establish early leadership in a global race. But while incumbents typically shape the rules of the race, true innovators bend or break the rules, and then they establish their own. That means product people should be constantly aware and beware of innovators. Just because you're winning the current race doesn't mean you're ready for the next one. And while innovators ultimately define the rules of the race, those who have innovated their way to the lead role in the race need to prepare for the day when they suddenly find the race is redefined, the rules are redrawn by the next innovator to come along. And of course, it will happen. And when that does, it's possible that few, if any, of the old rules will still apply. The race for innovation, after all, has no finish line. So thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and that you enjoy the rest of Productized.